The gun was already in Kate Grayson's hand when Wallace Covington walked through the door of the Dusty Creek Sheriff's office, and the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know about how close she was to using it. "Get out," she said. Her voice did not shake. That was the most terrifying part of it, the absolute stillness in her, like a river right before a flash flood. "I said get out, Covington. This is not your fight." Wallace looked at the man on the other side of the room. Amos Holt, land baron, patriarch of the most dangerous family west of the Pecos, sat in the wooden chair with his arms crossed and his eyes gleaming with the particular arrogance of a man who had never once been made to feel small. He had come with papers. He had come with lawyers. He had come with the deed to the Grayson family ranch pressed between his fat fingers like a weapon, which was precisely what it was. "She is right," Amos said, and he smiled at Wallace with teeth that were too white for a man so rotten on the inside. "This is a private matter, boy. The lady and I have business to settle." Wallace did not move. He stood in the doorway with his hat in one hand and his eyes on Kate, reading every line of her body the way a man reads weather on the horizon, looking for the storm behind the stillness. "Kate," he said quietly. "Do not," she said, and the word came out like a blade. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. He put his hat back on his head. And then he took exactly 3 steps into the room and leaned against the wall beside the door, folded his arms and looked nowhere in particular. She glared at him. He did not flinch. "I said I can handle this alone." "Yes," Wallace said, "you did." She stared at him for one long, burning moment, and then she turned back to Amos Holt with the gun still raised. And Wallace Covington stayed right where he was, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him like heat from a fire on a cold night, and he did not say another word unless she needed him to. That was how it began, or rather, that was where it peaked before everything that led up to it could finally be understood. To understand Kate Grayson, you had to understand what she was standing in. The year was 1882, and the town of Dusty Creek, Texas sat in a wide brown valley flanked by limestone bluffs and scrub oak that barely reached a man's shoulder. It was not a beautiful town by any reasonable standard. The main street was packed red clay, and it dried in summer and turned to boot-sucking mud every time a thunderstorm rolled off the plateau. There was a general store, a livery, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, and a land office that had been the source of more bloodshed in the last 5 years than any of the saloons combined. Kate had grown up on the Grayson Ranch, 6 miles east of Dusty Creek, on land her father had homesteaded in 1864. Elias Grayson had been a hard man and a quiet one, the kind of man who expressed love through labor, through fencing lines properly, and keeping the water tanks clean and teaching his daughter to ride before she could walk steadily on her own feet. Kate's mother, Clara, had died of typhoid fever when Kate was 11, and after that it had been just the 2 of them, father and daughter, working the land together until it felt less like property and more like a living thing that needed tending. Elias Grayson died in March of 1882, quietly in his own bed, which was more than most men in that country ever got. He left Kate the ranch, 400 acres of decent grass and a reliable creek, 30 head of cattle, 2 good horses, a debt of $340 at the Dusty Creek Bank, and a stubborn legacy of self-sufficiency that lived in her bones like marrow. She was 26 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, and she had absolutely no intention of letting anyone take what her father had built. Amos Holt had other intentions. Holt had been buying up land in Dusty Creek County for 3 years, mostly through legal means, and occasionally through methods that were harder to categorize but impossible to prosecute. He wanted the Grayson land specifically because the creek that ran through it was the most reliable water source in the southern part of the valley, and water in West Texas in 1882 was worth more than gold in practical terms. He had offered Kate money twice since her father's death, and twice she had declined, politely the first time and with more precision the second. The third approach was the one that arrived at the sheriff's office on a Tuesday afternoon in late April, and it came not in the form of an offer, but in the form of a legal document signed by a judge in San Antonio that Kate had never heard of, claiming that her father had borrowed money from Holt's Land Company 7 years ago, and that the debt, with accumulated interest, now exceeded the value of the property. It was a fabrication. Kate knew it was a fabrication. But the paper looked legitimate, and the sheriff, a thin, frightened man named Rudd who owed Holt his position, was inclined to accept it. Kate had walked into that sheriff's office with the deed to her property in one hand and her father's old Colt peacemaker in the other, and she had made her position on the matter very clear. And that was when Wallace Covington had walked through the door. Wallace was not from Dusty Creek. He had arrived 6 weeks before Grayson's death, riding in from the north on a big gray horse with a bedroll tied behind the saddle, and the look of a man who had been moving for a long time without any particular destination in mind. He had taken a room above the general store and found work with the Mueller Ranch, mending fences and working cattle, and he had kept mostly to himself in the way that men with complicated histories often did. He was 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of weathered cedar, a kind of warm gray-green that changed depending on the light. He had a scar that ran from his left jawline to his ear, thin and white and old, and he wore it the way most men wore old scars, without thinking about it, as though it had simply become part of the geography of his face. Kate had met him for the first time at the general store 4 weeks before her father died, when they had reached for the same tin of tobacco at the same moment and their hands had briefly touched over the counter. She had pulled her hand back immediately. He had stepped aside without making anything of it. "Sorry," she said, out of habit. "Don't be," he said. "Take it. I'll wait." She had looked at him then, really looked, which she did not often do with strangers. There was something careful about him. Careful in the way that a well-made thing is careful. Every part fitted precisely where it needed to be. His clothes were plain and clean. His gun was holstered and present but not displayed the way some men displayed theirs, like a vanity item. He looked at her directly, not boldly, just steadily, the way people look at things they are genuinely trying to understand. "You're new," she said. "6 days," he said. "Working for Mueller. Starting Monday." She had paid for her tobacco and left without saying anything else, but she had thought about him on the ride home, which she told herself was simply because new people in Dusty Creek were unusual, and not because of anything more specific than that. They encountered each other several more times in those weeks before her father died. Dusty Creek was not a large town, and their paths crossed naturally, at the general store, at the livery where they both kept horses, once at the church on a Sunday when the circuit preacher came through, and Kate sat 2 rows ahead of Wallace and did not look back at him once, which required more effort than she was willing to admit. After Elias died, Kate did not go into town for 2 weeks. There was too much to do on the ranch, and also she was grieving in the private, contained way she had learned from her father, keeping the feeling close and not letting it spill into anything that required an audience. When she came back to Dusty Creek for supplies, Wallace was at the hitching post outside the general store. He saw her before she saw him, and when she climbed down from her horse and looked up, he was already tipping his hat. "I heard about your father," he said. "I'm sorry." It was not the elaborate condolence she had been getting from people all week, the long sighing declarations about what a good man Grayson had been and how God must have had his reasons. It was just those 2 sentences, plain and direct, and they landed exactly right. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way she had not meant it for anyone else. That was the beginning of something, though neither of them would have called it that at the time. Wallace was not a man who moved quickly toward things he wanted. He had learned, through experiences he did not discuss openly, that the things worth having required patience, that forcing a moment was a reliable way to ruin it. And Kate Grayson, for all her formidable capability, was a woman who kept herself at a careful distance from things that had the potential to change her. She was fiercely competent. She ran the ranch alone, hiring day labor when she needed it and refusing help when she did not. She knew how to vaccinate cattle against blackleg, how to repair a windmill pump, how to read weather in the shape of clouds and the behavior of animals. She had a mind like a well-organized drawer, everything in its place and easily retrieved, and she did not tolerate inefficiency or sentimentality in herself. But she laughed when something struck her as genuinely funny. It was not a performative laugh, not the polite kind that women used socially. It was a real one, short and bright, slightly surprised, as though amusement had gotten the better of her before she could decide whether to let it. Wallace heard it for the first time at the livery, 2 weeks after the condolence at the general store. Kate had come to collect her mare, a sturdy roan named Pecan, and the livery keeper, old Mr. Fitch, was trying to tell her about a horse he had acquired that he claimed was part Arabian, and the horse in question was the most obviously not Arabian animal Wallace had ever laid eyes on, a round-bellied, short-legged chestnut with the temperament of a disgruntled mule. Kate looked at the horse for a long moment with absolutely no expression. Then she looked at Mr. Fitch. "That is not an Arabian, Mr. Fitch," she said. "Well now, there may be some mix in there." "There is no mix in there," she said. "That is a Mustang that someone fed very well for an extended period." And then she laughed, just briefly, and Wallace, who was on the other side of the stable collecting his own horse, heard it and felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately name. He did not say anything then. But when he led his gray gelding, whose name was Scout because Wallace was not a man who wasted creativity on horse names, out of the stable and found Kate tightening Pecan's cinch in the yard, he paused. "He told me it was quarter horse," Wallace said. She looked up. "What did you pay for it?" "Nothing. I bored him here, Mr. Fitch just likes to have opinions about horses." She looked at Scout with the same level professional assessment she had applied to the supposed Arabian. "He's good," she said. "Good shoulder." "Where'd you get him?" "Kansas," Wallace said. And then, because she had asked a direct question and he saw no reason not to answer it, he added, "I came down from Abilene. Before that, Nebraska. Before that, it gets complicated." She straightened up from the cinch and looked at him. Not the careful, measured look she used on horses, something more open than that. "Complicated how?" she said. He considered for a moment. "The kind of complicated that doesn't make for good telling at a livery stable," he said. She nodded, accepting this without pushing. "Kate Grayson," she said, even though they both knew by now who the other was. "I know," he said. "Wallace Covington." "I know," she said. And they rode out of town in opposite directions and did not speak again for 4 days. But something had been established between them, some mutual recognition that was not yet friendship, but was no longer simply the polite acknowledgement of 2 strangers sharing a small town. The Holt situation escalated 3 weeks after that. Kate had known Amos Holt was circling. She had known since the second rejected offer that he was not the kind of man who accepted no as a final answer. But she had not anticipated the legal route, had not imagined he would manufacture a fraudulent debt, because manufacturing fraudulent documents was the kind of thing that could theoretically be challenged in a real court, and she had assumed that Holt, for all his corruption, was careful enough to avoid that level of exposure. She had underestimated his desperation for the water rights, and overestimated his fear of legal consequence in a county where he owned most of the relevant officials. When the papers arrived at her ranch by courier on a Thursday morning, Kate read them 3 times at the kitchen table before she felt the shape of what she was dealing with. The document was signed by a Judge Warren Bledsoe of the Bixar County Court, and it claimed that Elias Grayson had borrowed $2,000 from the Holt Land and Development Company in 1875 for the purpose of purchasing cattle. The debt, at 12% annual interest over 7 years, was alleged to now total $4,800, which was approximately $800 more than Kate had in any form of accessible asset. She sat with the papers for a long time. Then she put them in her coat pocket, saddled Pecan, and rode into town. She did not go directly to the sheriff's office. First, she went to the bank, where she asked the manager, a decent, nervous man named Harold Sykes, whether he had any record of her father borrowing money from anyone in 1875. Harold checked his ledgers. Elias Grayson had borrowed money from the Dusty Creek Bank twice, once in 1869 for fence materials and once in 1873 for a new windmill pump. Both loans were repaid in full. There was no record of any transaction involving the Holt Land and Development Company. Could he have borrowed from them privately without going through you? Kate asked. Harold looked uncomfortable. It's possible, he said. I wouldn't have any record of a private arrangement, but your father was a careful man, Miss Grayson. He kept his own ledgers. If there was any such debt, he would have recorded it. Kate nodded. Her father's ledgers were at the ranch, in the tin box under the bed where he kept every financial record he had ever produced, going back to 1864. She had not yet had cause to go through them systematically. She went to the sheriff's office next, where Rudd was already holding a copy of the papers and looking like a man who had been told to swallow something unpleasant and was working up to it. Amos Holt was already there with his lawyer, a slick man from San Antonio named Carver, and it took Kate approximately 30 seconds to understand that this meeting had been arranged in advance and that she was expected to simply accept the situation. She did not accept it. She pulled out her own deed, her father's deed, recorded at the Dusty Creek Land Office in 1864, notarized and absolutely legitimate, and she put it on the desk in front of Rudd and told him clearly that she would be challenging this document in a real court, and that anyone who attempted to act on it in the meantime would find the experience educational. Amos Holt had smiled his too-white smile and said something about how the law was the law, and that was when Kate's hand had gone to her coat pocket, not to the papers but to the Colt peacemaker her father had left her, and the room had gone very quiet. And then the door had opened and Wallace Covington had walked in. She had stared at him with an expression that was equal parts fury and something she was not ready to name, the particular distress of someone who is deeply glad that a person has arrived and deeply unwilling to show it. "Get out," she had said. He had nodded and stayed. The standoff lasted approximately 20 minutes, which was long enough for Amos Holt to realize that the situation was not resolving in the clean, simple way he had planned for, and long enough for Sheriff Rudd to decide that whatever Holt paid him was probably not enough to die for. In the end, Holt and his lawyer left with their papers and their smiles, promising that the legal process would proceed regardless of anyone's objections. Kate uncocked the peacemaker and put it back in her pocket. Rudd left to check on something at the other end of the building, which meant he left to avoid having to look at either of them. Kate and Wallace were alone in the sheriff's office. She stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the door that Holt had gone through, and then she turned around. "I told you to leave," she said, not angry anymore, just stating it. "You did," he agreed. "I had it under control." He looked at her steadily. "You did," he said again. She waited for him to say something else, to explain himself, to defend the intrusion. He didn't. "Why did you stay?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, as though considering how much honesty the question deserved. Then he said, "Because Holt had 2 men outside the door that you didn't know about." She went very still. "They were on the boardwalk when I came in," Wallace said. "Armed. Positioned where they could come through fast if things went a direction Holt didn't want. You were watching Holt and Carver. You weren't watching the door." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, complicated and layered, gratitude and pride, and the particular discomfort of someone who has been protected without being diminished. "You should have told me," she said. "I was about to," he said. "But you got it resolved before I had to." She looked down at her hands. The deed was still in her left hand. The peacemaker was in her right coat pocket. "I need to go home and find my father's ledgers," she said. "All right," he said. "Alone," she said, looking up at him with something very clear and very deliberate in her eyes. He nodded. "Of course." She walked past him toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame and did not turn around. "Thank you," she said, "for the information about the men outside." "You're welcome," he said. She rode home. She did not look back down the street to see if he was watching, because she was not the kind of woman who looked back, and also because she was fairly certain he was, and she did not know yet what to do with that. The ledgers were in the tin box, exactly where she had known they would be. Her father's handwriting was small and precise, every transaction recorded in columns, date, description, amount, balance. Kate sat at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and went through every page from 1874 through 1876, looking for any record of a loan from anyone, let alone the Holt Land and Development Company. There was nothing, not a trace. In 1875, her father had sold 30 head of cattle for $900 to a rancher named Petty's in Careville, and he had used the proceeds to repair the barn roof and purchase a new breeding bull. He had not borrowed money that year. He had made it. The document Holt was using was a complete fabrication. Kate put the ledger down and pressed her fingers against her eyes and thought carefully about what she knew about the law in 1882 Texas. She knew that county courts were often corrupt and that Holt clearly had connections to the San Antonio bench. She knew that without an attorney of her own, she was at a severe disadvantage. She knew that the nearest reliable court that might be outside Holt's influence was in Austin, which was 200 miles from Dusty Creek. She also knew that she had approximately $40 in cash, which was not going to pay for an Austin attorney. She made herself eat something, because thinking required fuel, and then she sat back down with the ledgers and a piece of paper and started writing out everything she could document about the timeline of 1875, every cattle sale, every expense, every legitimate record that contradicted the Holt document. She worked until past midnight. Then she went to bed and lay on her back in the dark and thought about the two men outside the sheriff's office door, the one she had not known about, and she thought about Wallace Covington standing against that wall with his arms folded and his eyes quiet, not inserting himself, not taking over, just being present in the particular way that some people were present, so solidly that the room felt different with them in it. She did not sleep well. In the morning she rode into town early and went to the general store, where she bought coffee and a newspaper from Austin that was a week old. The Austin newspaper had a law directory printed in the back. She was looking for the name of a legitimate Texas attorney when the bell above the door jingled and Wallace came in. He saw her at the counter immediately. He nodded. She nodded back. He went to the far side of the store and began examining the selection of nails, which she knew was not why he had come in, because she had observed over the past weeks that Wallace Covington was a man of singular purpose who did not browse. She looked back at the law directory. "Do you know any lawyers in Austin?" She said without looking up. She was not asking him, she was asking the room, she was definitely asking him. "I knew one once," he said, still looking at the nails. "Name of Thomas Reed. He had a practice on Congress Avenue. Good man, honest, which made him unusual. Is he still there?" "I don't know, that was 4 years ago." She wrote the name down on her paper. "Thank you, you're writing to him." "I'm going to Austin," she said. There was a brief pause. "That's a long ride." "I know how long it is," she said. She put the paper in her pocket and folded the newspaper under her arm. "I have documentation that proves my father never borrowed that money. I need someone who can take it to a real court." "Holt will know you're going," Wallace said. He said it quietly, not alarmed, just noting a fact. "I expect he will," she said. "He has people between here and Austin." "I know the country," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When are you leaving?" "Tomorrow at dawn," she said. "Alone," she added, and the word had edges on it, not unkind edges but clear ones. "Of course," he said. She paid for her coffee and left. She was 3 miles out of Dusty Creek the following morning in the gray-pink light before full sunrise, with the ledgers and her documentation wrapped in oilcloth in her saddlebag and the peacemaker on her hip when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She did not stop. She did not even turn around immediately. She counted to 10, listening to the rhythm of the hooves, calculating speed and distance. Then she turned Pecan around on the trail and waited. Wallace Covington came around the bend on Scout at an easy lope. He slowed when he saw her stopped, and he came up to her and stopped too, and they looked at each other across 12 feet of morning trail with the scrub oak casting long shadows and the first birds calling in the distance. "I said alone," she said. "You did," he agreed. "You are following me." "I'm traveling south," he said, "to Austin." "I have business there," he said. She looked at him for a very long time. He met her gaze without flinching, without apology, without the slightest suggestion of self-consciousness. "What kind of business?" she said. "The kind that doesn't make for good telling on a trail," he said, and something in his delivery reminded her of what he had said at the livery about complicated histories, the same rhythm, the same careful honesty. She stared at him. He waited. "You will not ride with me," she said finally. "You will ride behind me or ahead of me or wherever you please, but this is not a joint expedition." "Understood," he said. "And if I tell you to go away, you will go away." "I will," he said. And the way he said it suggested that he believed this completely, and also that he had no particular expectation of needing to act on it. She turned Pecan around and continued south. Scout's hoofbeats fell in behind her at a respectful distance. She did not acknowledge this, but some part of her that she kept very quiet and very guarded felt something loosen slightly, the way a knot loosens under long, patient tension. They traveled for 3 days. The country between Dusty Creek and Austin was limestone plateau and cedar breaks and long stretches of open grass where the wind moved invisible waves through the bluestem. They made camp separately at night, which Kate had required and Wallace had accepted without complaint. He built a fire at a distance, and she built her own fire closer to where she picketed Pecan, and she went asleep to the smell of cedar smoke and the sound of coyotes and the knowledge that he was 20 yards away in the dark, which she found less irritating than she had anticipated. On the second day they forded the Llano River, which was running high from spring rains, and Kate got Pecan across without difficulty. But the current was strong and the footing was uneven, and Wallace crossed just behind her and did not say anything until they were both on the far bank, at which point he simply said, "Good crossing," as though she had accomplished something worth noting, which she had, but she had not expected him to observe it. "Your horse trusts you," he said. "We have an understanding," Kate said. "What kind?" She looked at the river for a moment. "I don't scare her on purpose," she said. "In exchange, she goes where I point her." He considered this. "That's a good arrangement. Most arrangements are when they're honest." She did not look at him when she said it, but she felt him hear it. On the second night she allowed the distance between their camps to shrink slightly, not from loneliness, she told herself, but because there was a strip of good flat ground between 2 outcrops and it made sense to use it. They ate separately, but afterward, when the fire was low and the night was full of stars and the kind of deep quiet that only existed far from towns, she found herself speaking. "The document Holt is using," she said. "It's signed by a judge named Bledsoe. Do you know him?" Wallace was quiet for a moment. "I know of him," he said. He had a reputation in San Antonio for being willing to look at cases from multiple angles, depending on who was funding the examination. "He's corrupt," she said. "Comprehensively," Wallace agreed. "Holt got to him." "Almost certainly." She stared at the fire. "My father built that ranch from nothing," she said. "He came to that land in 1864 with a horse and an axe and the clothes he was wearing. He dug the first well himself. He built the house board by board." She paused. "He was not a demonstrative man, but he loved that land. He loved it the way some people love living things." Wallace didn't say anything. He listened in the particular way he listened to things that mattered, with his full attention and without any impulse to fill the silence with his own words. "I'm not going to let Holt take it," she said. "I know," Wallace said. "I don't need anyone to believe in me," she said. It came out a little defensive, and she knew it, and she continued anyway. I'm just telling you so you understand why I'm making this trip. It's not recklessness, it's calculation." "I never thought it was reckless," he said. She looked across the fire at him. He was looking at the stars, his face tipped up slightly, his profile clean against the darkness. "Why are you really here?" she said. He brought his gaze down to her. "I told you, business in Austin." "Before that," she said, "why did you stay in that sheriff's office? You could have just told me about the men outside and left. You didn't have to stay." He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I didn't want to," he said simply. It was such a plain answer. No explanation, no justification, no story built around it. Just the truth of what he had felt, stated without decoration. She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at her fire. "That's not a reason," she said. "It's the only one I have," he said. She went asleep thinking about that, and dreamed of the ranch, of the creek running clear over limestone in the early summer, and woke before dawn with the feeling of something important taking shape at the edge of her understanding that she was not quite ready to examine directly. They reached Austin on the afternoon of the third day, coming in through the hills south of the city and down into the broad, flat valley of the Colorado River. Austin in 1882 was a proper city by Texas standards, with a real Capitol building under construction on the hill and paved streets in the center, and establishments of genuine sophistication, alongside the usual frontier roughness. Kate had been twice before and knew her way around enough to find a decent hotel on Congress Avenue where she took a room and arranged stabling for Pecan. Wallace took a room at the same hotel without discussing it with her, which she noted but did not address. She found Thomas Reed's law office the following morning, on the ground floor of a 3-story limestone building 2 blocks from the Capitol. Reed was in his 50s, compact and gray-haired, with the calm, measured manner of a man who had dealt with a great many difficult situations and learned to approach each one methodically. He read her documentation carefully, asked precise questions, and then sat back and looked at her with an expression that was reassuring without being false. "The document is fraudulent," he said. "The signature pattern on the Bledsoe seal is wrong. I've seen enough of his legitimate filings to know the difference. Beyond that, your father's ledgers are extraordinarily detailed and completely consistent. No court that isn't already bought would accept Holt's claim against this evidence. Can we challenge it?" Kate said. "We can do better than challenge it," Reed said. "There's a federal circuit judge named Harlan who will be in San Antonio in 3 weeks. He has no connection to Holt, no local political debt, and a reputation for taking document fraud very seriously. If we can file an injunction with him to stop any action on Holt's false deed while the matter is under investigation, Holt cannot legally move against your property." Kate let out a slow breath. "And if Holt moves before the injunction is filed, then we have a different problem," Reed said. "How confident are you in local law enforcement?" "The sheriff is Holt's," she said. Reed nodded, unsurprised. "Then we need to be faster than Holt expects." He looked at her across the desk. "Do you have anyone you trust in Dusty Creek who could watch the property while you're here?" She thought about this. "Possibly," she said. She went back to the hotel and knocked on the door of the room she knew was Wallace's because it was next to the stairs and he would have chosen that one for the visibility on both directions of approach, which was the kind of thing she had noticed about him without intending to. He opened the door and looked at her. "I need a favor," she said. The word favor cost her something. She said it anyway. "All right," he said. "Reed says we can get a federal injunction, but it will take 2 weeks, possibly 3. I need someone back at the ranch who can document any attempt by Holt or his people to take possession. Someone who Holt would think twice about confronting directly." Wallace leaned against the doorframe. "You want me to go back to Dusty Creek?" "I want you to watch the ranch," she said. "Not to defend it, just to witness. A credible witness to any illegal action would strengthen the legal case considerably. And you'll stay here to work with Reed." "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "You trust me on your land," he said, "not a question." Something in it that sounded almost careful, the way you handle something you don't want to damage. She held his gaze. "I trust your judgment," she said, "and I trust your reasons for doing what you do, even when you don't explain them." Something shifted in his expression, barely perceptible, a small movement in those gray-green eyes that she had learned to read the way she read weather. "I'll leave in the morning," he said. "Thank you," she said. She was halfway down the hall when he said her name for the first time, not Miss Grayson. Kate, just her name, said quietly, like something he had been holding for a while. She stopped but did not turn around. "Be careful with Reed," he said. "He's honest, but Holt has reach in Austin too." She nodded once and continued down the hall. She thought about the sound of her name in his voice for the rest of that evening, and told herself firmly that this was not relevant to anything, and believed it less and less as the night went on. The 2 weeks in Austin were the most complicated of Kate's life, not because of the work with Reed, which was painstaking but manageable, but because of the quiet that opened up when she was alone in a hotel room in a strange city with no daily labor to anchor her to the ordinary. Reed was excellent. He prepared the injunction filing with meticulous care, documenting the fraudulent elements of the Bledsoe signature and seal, compiling a timeline from Kate's father's ledgers that made the fabrication unmistakable, and drafting a letter to Judge Harlan's circuit office requesting expedited consideration given the threat to the property. Kate spent 4 hours a day with Reed, and the rest of the time in a state of disciplined waiting that she found more difficult than any physical labor she had ever performed. She read. She walked the streets of Austin in the early morning before the heat came in. She wrote a long letter to the Mueller Ranch asking them to tell Wallace if he came by that the filing was proceeding. She did not write to Wallace directly. She was not ready to explain to herself why she wanted to. 12 days after she arrived in Austin, a letter came from Dusty Creek. It was not from Wallace. It was from old Mr. Fitch at the livery, who was one of those invaluable old men that every small town possessed, apparently invisible and actually watching everything. Fitch wrote in a shaky but legible hand that 3 days after Kate had left for Austin, 2 men she did not recognize had ridden out toward the Grayson Ranch on the eastern road. The following morning they had ridden back and gone directly to Holt's main house. Fitch did not know what they had done at the ranch, but he wanted her to know. Kate read the letter twice and then went to find Reed. Reed read it and went straight to his desk. "I'm filing the injunction today," he said. "Not when I planned, today. Judge Harlan's clerk owes me a professional courtesy and I am going to call it in." "What will that do?" Kate said. "If Harlan signs it, which I believe he will, any further action by Holt to take possession of your property becomes a federal contempt matter. That is a different order of consequence than a county dispute. And those men at the ranch, if they damaged anything or attempted to assert ownership, we add that to the filing." Reed looked at her over his glasses. "Go back to Dusty Creek, Miss Grayson. Be there when this lands, and take someone with you on the road." She was back at the hotel packing her saddlebag inside of 20 minutes. The ride back was different from the ride down. She went faster, pushing Pecan to a pace that covered ground without exhausting her, and she traveled alone this time, truly alone, because Wallace was already in Dusty Creek, and there was no quiet presence on scout following behind her. She had not expected to notice the absence as much as she did. She arrived in Dusty Creek on a Thursday afternoon, arriving from the south along the creek road and coming up onto her own land through the eastern pasture, and the first thing she saw was that the gate on the eastern fence line had been forced. The lock was broken and the wire was cut and then loosely rewound, as though someone had tried to make it look intact. She dismounted and examined the fence carefully. It had been done recently, within the last 2 weeks, by the rust pattern on the cut wire ends. She remounted and rode toward the house. The house was intact. The cattle were in the north pasture where she had left them. The windmill was running. The creek was clear. And Wallace Covington was sitting on her front porch steps, drinking coffee from a tin cup, looking like a man who had been there long enough that the porch had accepted him. He stood when he saw her riding in, and there was something in the way he stood, Not the casual unfolding of a man getting up from comfortable rest, but the movement of a man who has been watching for something and is glad it has arrived. She dismounted and tied Pecan at the rail and looked at him. "The east fence was cut," she said. "2 weeks ago," he said. "I saw the tracks. 2 riders came in that way. They rode to the creek, looked at the water access, and rode back out. Didn't touch the cattle or the house. I think they were assessing." "Assessing for what?" "For how to make a claim that the property was already in Holt's possession," Wallace said. "If they can show their men were on the land and there was no challenge, it muddies the ownership question." Kate felt cold. "Were you here when they came?" "No," he said. "I found the tracks the next day, but I've been here since." He paused. "I hope that's all right." She looked at him. He was standing on her porch steps with his hat in his hand and his eyes direct and without pretense, and he looked entirely natural there, which was the thing that unsettled her most profoundly. "You've been staying here," she said. "In the barn," he said immediately. "I didn't go in the house." She almost said something about that but stopped herself, because what she had been about to say was something like "you could have gone in the house," and she needed to think carefully about whether she meant that. "Come inside," she said instead. "I'll make coffee and you can tell me everything that happened." She made coffee on the iron stove her father had hauled out from San Antonio by wagon in 1871, and Wallace sat at the kitchen table and told her about the 2 riders and the fence, and the additional thing he had found, which was a document nailed to the fence post near the creek. A handwritten notice claiming the water rights of Dusty Creek and its tributaries were under review by the Holt Land and Development Company, pending resolution of the debt matter. Kate's hands went still around her coffee cup. "That's a bluff," she said. "It's a document," Wallace said, "which is different from a legitimate claim but useful for certain purposes." "I have the injunction," Kate said. "Reed filed it. Judge Harlan signed it 4 days ago. Holt cannot take any action against this property while the federal investigation proceeds." Wallace absorbed this for a moment. His expression did something that took her a moment to identify as relief. "Then it's over," he said. "Not over," she said. "The investigation will take time, and Holt will look for other angles, but he can't move against the property directly. And the document fraud will eventually reach a real court, and when it does," she stopped. "When it does, there will be consequences. For Holt," she said, "and for Bledsoe." She looked across the table at him. He was looking at his coffee, turning the cup slowly in his hands, a gesture she had noticed before, something he did when he was thinking. "Why did you come to Dusty Creek?" she said. He looked up. "The real reason," she said. "Not just the bedroll and the Mueller Ranch job. You came from Abilene, you said, and before that Nebraska. Men who move like that are usually moving towards something or away from something. Which one is it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Both," he said. She waited. He turned the cup again. "My father had a ranch in Nebraska," he said. "Not unlike this one. He built it from nothing, the same way your father did. In 1878, a railroad company decided they wanted the right-of-way through the south quarter of our land. My father said no. They said yes, through a process that looked legal and wasn't." He paused. "We lost the land. My father didn't recover from it. He died the following winter, which the doctor called heart failure and which I call something else." Kate was very still. "I spent 2 years trying to fight the railroad through the courts," he said. "I found out what worked and what didn't. I found out which attorneys were honest and which were bought, and which judges you could trust and which ones you couldn't get near. I found out that documentation is the thing that matters most, more than guns or reputation or how loudly you argue." He looked at her. "And then I stopped being able to stay in Nebraska, and I headed south." She thought about what it had cost him to say that. She thought about the scar on his jawline and the way he held himself, not like a man who was afraid of the world, but like a man who had tested the world and found it harder than expected and adjusted accordingly. "The 2 men outside the sheriff's office door," she said slowly. "I've seen that before," he said. "That arrangement. Men positioned at the exit in case the legal approach fails and force becomes necessary. It's a standard tactic for that kind of operation. You knew what Holt was doing because you'd seen it done to your father. Yes, he said. She looked at him for a long time. I'm sorry about your father, she said. He nodded, accepting it the way he accepted most things, directly and without making it theatrical. I'm sorry about yours, he said. They sat in the kitchen with the afternoon light coming in through the window and the coffee going cool in their cups, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the silence had a quality to it that Kate recognized as different from the silences they had shared on the trail, less guarded, more honest. The silence of two people who have told each other real things and are still sitting at the same table. There is something I should tell you, Kate said. He looked at her. I have known since the second day out of Austin that you weren't just following me south for business, she said. I worked it out. I am not stupid and I am not unobservant. He didn't deny it. I could have insisted you go back, she said. On the trail, in Austin, when you offered to come back here to watch the ranch, I could have found another solution. You could have, he said. I didn't want to, she said, and the echo of his own words landed between them and they both heard it. He looked at her with those gray-green eyes that were almost the color of the cedar brakes in late afternoon light, and she looked back at him steadily, two very careful people standing at the edge of something they had both been approaching for weeks. Kate, he said. I know, she said. I'm not saying I know what to do about it. I'm saying I know it's there. That's enough, he said. For now. She nodded. They drank their cold coffee and talked about the injunction and what would happen next with Holt's case, and it was ordinary conversation handled with ordinary competence, but under it something had changed, something that could not be put back the way it had been. He slept in the barn that night. She lay in her bed in the house listening to the night sounds, the creak and the wind and the distant protest of a great horned owl, and she thought that the barn was very close for something that was supposed to be a distance. The next 3 weeks were a particular kind of quiet that Kate had never experienced before in her life. Holt, once served with the federal injunction, went still. His lawyer Carver came to Dusty Creek and met with Sheriff Rudd, and then Rudd came to the Grayson ranch and told Kate, with enormous personal discomfort, that the matter was being reviewed at the federal level, and that he was directed to advise her of her rights as a property owner during the investigation period. Which was to say, Rudd had been told by someone with more authority than Holt to remember whose side the law was actually supposed to be on. Kate thanked him politely, and watched him ride away with the satisfaction of someone watching a very slow mechanism finally produce the result it was designed for. Wallace moved from the barn to a spot under the live oak near the creek, which was slightly more comfortable and substantially less distant, and they established a daily rhythm that was neither formal nor forced. He helped with the cattle in the mornings, not because she asked, but because there was work and he could see it, and he was the kind of person who did work that needed doing. She cooked in the evenings and they ate together at the kitchen table, and they talked about a great many things, none of which were about what was happening between them. They talked about Nebraska and Texas and the different qualities of grass in different soils. They talked about the cattle market and the railroad expansion, and whether the state government in Austin was likely to get more or less corrupt over the coming decade. Wallace had opinions on these things that were informed and considered, and Kate found that she liked being disagreed with by someone who had reasons for their position, which was not something she had encountered frequently. She told him about her mother. She had not talked about her mother to anyone in a very long time. She was funny, Kate said. People don't usually say that first about their mothers, but she was. She had a very dry sense of humor. She could say something perfectly ordinary, and you would realize a second later that it was devastating. Kate paused. She would have had things to say about this whole situation with Holt that would have been very funny and also completely accurate. What would she have said? Wallace asked. Kate thought about it. She would have said that a man who has to forge documents to get what he wants is a man who knows what he wants isn't his. Wallace smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen from him, Not the brief, small expressions he made when something amused him, but a full smile, and it changed his face considerably, made him look younger, less guarded, more like a person who had once been easy in the world before the world educated him otherwise. She felt something move in her chest that was not subtle and not easily dismissed. She looked away. "I need to check the windmill," she said. "I already did," he said. She looked back at him. He was still smiling slightly. "When," she said, "this morning, the check valve was loose. I tightened it." She stared at him for a moment between exasperation and something else entirely. "You checked my windmill." "I was up early and it was rattling," he said simply. She thought about arguing and decided against it. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," he said. On a Sunday evening in late May, 3 weeks after Kate's return from Austin, Thomas Reed sent a letter. Judge Harlan had reviewed the documentation. He had agreed that the Bledsoe signature was fraudulent. He had issued a formal finding that the Holt Land and Development Company's claim against the Grayson property was void and without legal basis. Additionally, he had referred the matter of the forged judicial signature to the state attorney general for investigation of Judge Bledsoe. The Grayson ranch was safe. The legal threat was over. Kate read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table, and then she put it down and pressed her hands flat against the wood surface, and she breathed. Wallace was outside. She could hear him at the fence line on the south side of the yard, which had a post that needed resetting. She got up and walked out into the late golden light of the evening and crossed the yard to where he was tamping dirt around the base of a new fence post. He looked up when he heard her coming. She held out Reed's letter. He read it. She watched his face as he did. He finished and looked up at her, and in his expression was something complex, a relief that went deeper than this specific situation, as though this resolution was touching something older and more personal than the Grayson Ranch dispute. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He handed the letter back. She folded it carefully. "Wallace," she said. "Yes." She looked at him in the golden light with the live oaks behind him and the creek sound in the air and the smell of turned earth and cedar, and she said, "I would very much like you to stay." He went very still. "Not in the barn," she said, and her voice was level and direct because she had decided that if she was going to say it, she was going to say it clearly and not hide it in implication. "I would like you to stay, on the ranch, here, if that is something you want." "Kate," he said, "I am asking you a direct question," she said. "You can give me a direct answer." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he stepped over the fence post and the tamping bar and crossed the 3 feet between them and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the individual gray-green shades in his eyes. "There is nothing I want more," he said. She had expected to feel more complicated about it, more guarded, more like herself as she had always understood herself to be. Instead, she felt something open up, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical suddenness of the novels she had read, but quietly, like a door that has been warped by weather finally swinging free on its hinges. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, the side with the scar, and he closed his eyes briefly, and she felt him breathe. He kissed her with the same quality that characterized everything else he did, careful and deliberate and absolutely present, like a man who understands that the moment's worth having require your full attention. She kissed him back, and the evening light went gold around them, and the creek ran in the distance, and the land that her father had built was solid under their feet. There was still work to do. There was always work to do in that country in that time, the endless practical labor of keeping a ranch alive, the cattle and the fencing and the water and the weather. Kate was not a romantic in the sense of believing that love resolved the practical difficulties of existence. But she was discovering, in the weeks that followed, that the practical difficulties of existence were considerably more manageable when someone who cared about the outcome was working alongside you. Wallace Covington was, it turned out, an exceptional rancher. He had grown up on his father's Nebraska spread and had the knowledge embedded in his hands and habits, the particular attentiveness to weather and animal behavior, and the slow rhythms of land that could not be learned from books. He had thoughts about how to improve the water distribution from the creek to the north pasture, and he expressed them once clearly, and then waited for her response. And when she said she thought his plan was good, but that there was a better slope for the secondary channel on the eastern side, he considered it and said she was right. He was the first man Kate had ever encountered who could be told he was wrong about something and not take it as an attack on his entire person. They were not without friction. Kate was accustomed to making every decision alone, and the adjustment of consulting another person on things that concerned the ranch, even a person she trusted, required conscious effort. There were moments when she felt the old self-sufficiency rise up in her like a reflex, moments when she caught herself starting to handle something without telling him, not out of deception but out of pure habit. One morning she had gotten up before dawn to deal with a heifer that was having difficulty calving, because she had noticed the signs the evening before and not mentioned them to Wallace, because she had handled difficult calvings alone before and did not think to say anything. She had been in the barn for 2 hours when he appeared in the doorway with a lantern, took in the situation, and without a word knelt down beside her and helped. They saved the calf, a blocky red bull calf that was ornery from his first breath. When it was over and they were washing up at the yard pump, Kate said, "I should have woken you." "You could have handled it alone," Wallace said. "Yes," she said, "but I didn't have to." He looked at her with that particular quality of attention he had, that sense of full presence. "No," he said, "you didn't." She reached over and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers. They stood at the yard pump in the early morning with the birth smell of the barn on them, and the first light coming pink over the eastern limestone ridge. And it was not a glamorous moment by any standard, and it was also one of the best moments of her life. Wallace proposed in June on a Wednesday, which she always thought afterward was a very Wallace thing to do, not a special occasion, not a designed romantic moment, just a Wednesday morning after breakfast when they were both in the kitchen and the light was coming in through the east window, and he looked at her across the table and said, "I want to marry you if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment. "I am," she said. "Good," he said. They sat there for another moment. "That's it," she said. "I could add something more," he said. "Please don't," she said, and she was smiling, the full real smile that surprised her, and he was smiling too, and it was enough. They were married in August of 1882 at the Dusty Creek Church, which was also the schoolhouse on weekdays and therefore smelled slightly of chalk dust, which Kate found appropriate. Reverend Halsey, the circuit preacher who had previously presided over services they had attended in their separate pews, performed the ceremony with a directness and lack of ornamentation that suited them both. Mr. Fitch was there, wearing his best coat. Thomas Reed came up from Austin on the stagecoach. The people from the Mueller Ranch came. Harold Sykes from the bank came with his wife. A surprising number of Dusty Creek residents who had watched the Holt situation unfold and been privately rooting for Kate the entire time came, because small towns always knew more than they let on. Amos Holt was not there. Amos Holt was in San Antonio that week, dealing with the state attorney general's investigation of Judge Bledsoe, which had expanded to include an examination of several other property cases in the region where Holt's Land Company appeared to have been involved in fraudulent documentation. He would, over the following 2 years, find himself legally occupied in a way that left him very little time for water rights in Dusty Creek County. His land empire would not collapse entirely, because men like Amos Holt had too many resources for clean and total collapse, but it would diminish substantially, and his influence over local officials would evaporate as the scrutiny intensified. Sheriff Rudd resigned in September and moved to El Paso. His replacement was a young man from Kerr County named Alderman, who had no particular relationship with Holt and a personal commitment to his job that made the town measurably safer within a year of his appointment. These things unfolded slowly, as justice usually did in that time and place, not in the dramatic, clean instant of a moral lesson, but in the grinding, gradual manner of institutional correction. Kate watched it happen with the satisfaction of someone who had done the right thing the right way and waited for the right result, knowing all along that it was not guaranteed, but that the alternative was impossible. She was watching it happen beside Wallace, which made it better. The ranch grew in the years that followed. They acquired an additional 120 acres of adjacent land when a neighboring homesteader named Potts decided the frontier life was not for him and offered them a fair price. They improved the water system, extending the channel from the creek into the new pasture exactly as Wallace had suggested, with the adjustment Kate had proposed, and it worked beautifully. In the spring of 1883, Kate discovered she was pregnant. She was not entirely surprised, and she was not frightened, which might have surprised some people given her solitary nature. But Kate Grayson had never been frightened of difficult things, only of losing what mattered. She told Wallace on a Tuesday morning with the same directness she applied to everything. "We're going to have a child," she said. He went very still for a moment, in the particular way he went still when something moved him that he was not going to perform about. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers and said, "Are you well?" "Completely," she said. He nodded. Then he said very quietly, "Good." She saw something in his face that she recognized as the same thing she felt, that complicated combination of joy and sobriety that comes when something you want arrives, and you understand for the first time how much you wanted it. Their son was born in November of 1883. In the bedroom of the house Elias Grayson had built board by board in 1864, delivered by a midwife named Mrs. Ochoa, who had been delivering babies in Dusty Creek County for 20 years, and who had a perfectly calibrated combination of practical skill and reassuring calm. He was a healthy boy, large and vocal from his first breath, with his father's coloring and what Mrs. Ochoa said were his mother's eyes. They named him Elias Wallace Covington, which was Kate's idea, and Wallace received it with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Elias grew up on the ranch the way his grandfather had built it, and his parents had defended it and expanded it, learning to ride early and to work the land with the same embedded competence that was, by that point, a Grayson family inheritance, passed through a father who had loved the land, through a daughter who had refused to let it go, and now into a son who would carry it forward. Kate and Wallace had 2 more children. A daughter in 1886, named Clara after Kate's mother, which made Kate cry in a way she had not cried since her father's death, not from grief, but from the particular tenderness of giving someone's name back to the world. And then a second son in 1888, named Thomas, for Thomas Reed, who had filed the injunction that saved everything, and who attended the christening from Austin on the stagecoach and cried considerably more than anyone else present. Thomas Reed was not a man generally given to public emotion, but he told them afterward with more candor than he usually employed, that the Grayson case had been the one in his career that he was most proud of. "Not because we won," he said. "We won cases that were easier. It's because we did it right, document by document, court by court, the proper way." "My father would have appreciated that," Kate said. "Your father built a ranch worth fighting for," Reed said. "That was the foundation of it." The year 1888 was also the year that the Holt matter concluded finally and completely. Amos Holt had been the subject of the state investigation for 6 years by that point, and the investigation had found what investigations find when they are conducted honestly and given enough time, which was a pattern of fraud extending back further than the Grayson matter, encompassing several other property cases in 3 counties, where legitimate owners had been forced off their land through fabricated debts and compliant judges. Holt was convicted on 3 counts of filing fraudulent legal documents and 1 count of conspiracy to defraud. He was sentenced to 12 years in the state prison at Huntsville. Judge Bledsoe, who had cooperated with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence, received 4 years. Kate read the news in the Dusty Creek Gazette on a Saturday morning in October of 1888, sitting at the kitchen table with Clara on her lap, and the sound of Elias and Wallace working in the yard coming through the open window. She read the article twice and then set the paper down. Clara, who was 2 years old and had strong opinions about being put down, grabbed the paper and attempted to eat it. "Don't eat that," Kate said and took it back. "She's going to eat everything for another year," Wallace said from the doorway. He came in and poured coffee and sat down across from her. "What is it?" She handed him the paper, folded to the article. He read it. She watched him. He finished and looked up. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He looked at her steadily for a long moment, and she looked back at him. And there passed between them in that look the entire arc of what they had been through together. The sheriff's office with the peacemaker in her hand, the trail south through the limestone breaks, the Austin law office, the kitchen table and the cold coffee, the fence post in the golden evening light, the calving barn in the early morning, the church that smelled of chalk dust, the children, the years of work, the land underfoot and the creek running clear. "Your father would be glad," Wallace said. "Yes," she said. "He would." Clara grabbed for the coffee cup. They both moved at the same moment to intercept it, their hands meeting over the table, and they laughed. Kate's real laugh, short and bright and slightly surprised, and Wallace's full smile that still, after 6 years, made him look younger and less guarded. And Clara, annoyed at being thwarted, made her opinion clear in a way that woke baby Thomas from his nap in the other room. It was a completely ordinary Saturday morning in October in West Texas, 1888. It was, Kate thought, getting up to attend to Thomas with Clara on her hip, and the autumn light coming warm through the kitchen window and her husband's presence as solid and familiar as the land itself. Everything she had ever wanted, dressed up in the perfectly unremarkable clothes of everyday life. She had handled it alone, all of it, for as long as she had needed to, and she would handle it alone again if she ever had to, because that was simply who she was. But she didn't have to. She hadn't had to in a long time. Wallace Covington had walked through the door of the sheriff's office in Dusty Creek, Texas, on a Tuesday afternoon in April of 1882, and she had told him to get out, and he had nodded, and he had stayed close anyway. And in all the years that followed, all the good and difficult and beautiful ordinary years, she was never once sorry that he had. The ranch ran well. The creek kept running. The grass came back every spring after the brown of winter, reliable as anything in that country was reliable, which was never absolutely certain but good enough to bet your life on. The children grew and learned to work, and occasionally to complain about working, which Kate took as a sign of healthy spirit and Wallace took as an opportunity to demonstrate that the work was worth doing. Elias, at 6, had his grandfather's seriousness. Clara had her grandmother's humor, dry and precise, and usually deployed at the moment of maximum impact. Thomas, the youngest, was an entirely different creature from either of them, open and sociable and perpetually cheerful in a way that mystified both of his more contained parents and delighted everyone else. Kate sometimes looked at her children and thought about what they were made of, not just in the physical sense but in the deeper sense, the things that had to happen for them to exist at all. Her father's stubborn labor, her own refusal to let go, a federal judge's honest signature, a law office on Congress Avenue, a trail south through the cedar breaks, a man who nailed fence posts on Wednesday mornings and saved her windmill check valve without being asked and stayed when she told him to go. All of those things stacked up like foundation stones, everything that had come before making what came after possible. There was a particular evening in the fall of 1889 when Wallace and Kate were on the porch after supper, the children inside doing various things that involved occasional loud noises but nothing alarming. The air had the first real chill of autumn in it, and the stars were beginning to come out over the plateau, and the creek sound was at its evening pitch, low and steady. Kate had her coffee and Wallace had his, and they sat in the 2 chairs that had replaced the single chair her father had kept on the porch, and they did not say anything for a long time. "I've been thinking about the north pasture fence," Wallace said. "The third post on the west side is going to fail before winter," Kate said. "I know. I'll order the post when I go to town Thursday. I'll ride with you." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the stars with the particular expression he wore when he was content, not dramatically, not in a way that required comment, just visibly at ease in the way that a man who has lived with difficulty long enough to appreciate its absence becomes. "You don't have to come to town," she said. "I know," he said. She smiled and looked back at the stars. He reached over and took her hand, which was calloused from work and strong and familiar to him in every detail, and she let him, which was the simplest and most profound thing she did every day. Let him be close. Let him stay. Let the careful distance she had built around herself over years of necessary solitude remain open in the particular direction of this particular man. She had told him she could handle it alone. She always could. She always had been able to. But he had stayed anyway, at a respectful distance and then a smaller distance and then no distance at all, until the word alone lost its urgency and became simply an option, one she could choose when she needed it and set aside when she didn't. That was, she had come to understand, what love looked like when it was done right. Not the replacement of independence with dependency, not the disappearance of the self into the other, but the quiet expansion of what was possible when you stopped facing everything across the barrier of your own pride, when you let someone stand close enough to see you clearly and chose to let them stay. The stars deepened overhead. The creek ran in the dark. The children made their indoor noises. The land lay quiet and substantial around them, all 520 acres of it, 400 original and 120 acquired, crossed by a reliable creek and carrying good grass, and standing under a big West Texas sky that went on and on without apology, full of weather and light, and the particular beauty of a place that did not make things easy but was worth everything you gave it. Kate Grayson Covington held her husband's hand on the porch her father had built, and the evening settled around them like something decided and complete, and she was, in the truest and most uncomplicated sense of the word, at home. Not just in the house, not just on the land, but in the life she had made and defended and chosen, with all the difficulty and work and grace that choosing required, in all the years she had been capable of handling everything alone and all the years she had not had to. Both things were true, both things were hers, and that finally was enough.